All right, so let's get into forms. And some of you may be saying, well, why are we talking about forms, right? Because that's primarily an HTML element, right? Well, the common thing throughout this class is that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all work together, right? So we use the HTML and the CSS to display things, make it pretty, etc. But we use our JavaScript to make it interactive. So what type of interactivity do we need with forms? Well, first of all, we know that we need to get the data from forms so it can be processed, right? Which we saw with our login forms. We pull the data from the form so we can check the logins, etc. But what about validation? What about uh, making sure that the data is correct or match a certain pattern? If I put in adrian.tillman@gmail.com, how do you verify that that user has actually put in a valid email, right? What format? What about giving feedback to our users, right? Feedback is very important. We want to not only allow our users to put in data, but we want to give them visual feedback for what they're doing and where they're going wrong, right? So we've seen that when we did our login, we did a pop-up or an alert that said, hey, you put in the wrong value, it doesn't match, or you put in invalid credentials. Now, what's bad about that? Well, pop-ups and alerts are old school. We don't like to use them anymore because users can turn off pop-ups and they can block them, and it's just bad practice now. So we would like to be more interactive or take a better approach to doing these things. So with this module, we'll look at some of the things that we can do with forms, or the common things we do with forms via JavaScript. Here you see an example of a registration form. It takes the first name, the last name, the email address, the phone number, the city, the state, and the zip code. All right, so here you see us giving some feedback for the user. So I created this form, or I enter values in this form, but I did not select a state. Notice what we did. We made the state red, the name of the field red, and we said please select your state. So we're drawing our users' attention to the error that they made in the form. All right, so how are we doing this, right? It's dynamic. How are we doing? If I select the state, right, and I try to register, well, if I select the state and register, it'll go away. It'll let me register. All right, so how do we do something like this? All right, so let's take a look at some code that will allow us to do something like this. Here we have a JavaScript called error messages. All right, now what does this script do? Well, we know that in a page, it could be in a state where they haven't entered any values, and hence it would display all black, all our columns would be black, and there'd be no error message, right? But if they do something wrong, then we want to add an error message to the page, right? And if they do it correct, we want to remove the error message from the page. So if they make another mistake and register, then that field will be highlighted, but if they fix the other problem, then that one would be removed. So we need the ability to add error messages and remove error messages. So we can create a JavaScript to do that. All right. Now, as you watch these lectures where I talk about this, again, focus on the concepts that I'm talking about because they all apply to different things, but don't focus in on the specific thing like, oh, this is how I add error messages. This is all I need to know. No, you need to know how we approach these types of things, right? Now, when we talk about adding an error message, right? So we may say, okay, when the user makes a mistake, we want to highlight the text and we want to put an error message beside the form field that they messed up. So those are our requirements, right? All right, so from the JS level, we just need to add some error message to some element, and we need to be able to remove some error message from some element. All right, so the add error message reflects that. It takes the ID of what? The ID of the form element, right? And it also takes the message that we want to display. All right, so here we see that we get a reference to that element. Well, that's nothing new. We've always used document.getElement by ID to get an element. So you should be used to seeing that by now. All right. Now we're going to create a new ID. Well, why are we creating a new ID? Because we want to be able to remove it later. All right. So we're just going to append error to the ID. All right. So now we need to see, because it could be the case that they've submitted some other that they've toggled it and they fixed it, and now we need to check and see if that error message already exists. All right, because we don't want to add it twice if it already exists. So we're going to retrieve, or we're going to try to retrieve an element that has that new ID with that error attached to it, right? If it does, then this will have a value. Span will have a value. If it doesn't, then it does not exist. So we can take advantage of that, right? If span, right, we're checking to see if it's truthy. If it's truthy, it has a value. It'll be truthy, right? Then we're just going to set the value of the first child to our message, all right? We're going to update it. If it's not new, if it doesn't exist, then we're going to create it, all right? So we're going to use document.createElement to create a span, all right? So we use create element when we want to create some sort of HTML element. In this case, we want to create a span, all right? We're going to set that span's ID to our new ID that we created, and we're going to give it a class name of error. Notice that we've done when we want to manipulate things, we often change the class name. Well, why are we changing the class name in this case? Well, we know that we want these errors to display in red. So we can assume that error, we look in our CSS, anything with a class name of error, let's search for it, right, is going to be red, all right? Now that we've done that, we're going to create a new text node to store the message, and we're going to append that to the span. So remember how that document or that DOM model works, where you keep appending elements to the parent. All right. Once we do that, then we can add the span to the original element. All right. And then we're also going to give the original element's class name error as well, so that displays in red. And that's going to add the error message for us. So let's check that out in code. All right, so if we run this again, if I hit register, I'm going to put a breakpoint over here and add error message. I'm going to hit register. So let's step through this code and look at it. Uh-oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong form. I want this one. So let's continue on here. All right. All right, so we're in the add error message function. All right, so we're going to step over and we retrieve the element. All right, so that's our select state element. See how I highlighted and it corresponds to the one on the screen that's not selected? All right, so let's step over. So we create that new ID, so state error. All right, let's get a reference to the span. In this case, it exists, so we just want to update it. All right, so we update the value, and then that's it. All right, now let's look at removing the error when we correct it. All right, so in remove, we need the ID that we want to remove the error from, right? So we're going to get that element that contains that ID with the error appended to it, right? Because we don't want the original element, we want the span that we created that displays the error message. All right, so we're going to check and see if it exists. If it does, we want to remove that class name because we no longer want it to be in red, right? So we just want to remove that class name that makes it red. Right? And then we want to remove that span, right? That span that we created that displays that error message, we're going to remove it. So get the parent node of our span, so that tells us the parent node that that span belongs to, and then we say remove any children that it has. Well, the child that we have is the span. That's the child that we want to remove. All right, so let's take a look at that in code or real time. So let's select the state. Let's select the state, but let us change the email so it's not valid. Okay, now let's register. All right, so now we're back at our remove error message function. All right, so what ID are we passing in? Well, the first name field. Let's skip that one because we don't want the first name field. We want to remove email. There we go. So there's our email popping up. So this is going to add a error message to the email. All right, so we see that error message for the email popped up, right? Because that was invalid. Let's keep going. All right, so let's see if this is our, nope, that's phone. Phone is valid. What is this? Is this state? All right, so this is state. State is going to get removed now because it does not have any errors. All right, so we retrieve that span. Of course, this should not be null, right? Because it has one. All right, and because it has one, then we remove it. All right, And then we're going to, we're going to remove the class name, right? So now you see that state is no longer in red, right? To the left, state is no longer red because we removed the class name from that. And now we remove the node. Notice it disappeared from the page, all right? And that's all to that. So very exciting stuff that we can do with JavaScript. Let's also talk about, since we talked about adding and removing elements, let's look at tooltips. So what are tooltips, right? Tooltips are things that we want the user to see to give them tips on how to do something. So for instance, if we want the user to enter in the phone number with dashes, we may, as they hover over this, we may display a tooltip like such, right? So we want to give we always want to strive to give our users feedback to help them input their data correctly, all right, or cut down on mistakes. That's just good practice, y'all. So let's see how we could do something like this, right? Can we do this with HTML? All right, so let's take a look at the CSS for this. Or in fact, let's look at the HTML for our register form. All right, so we see form validation. All right, do we have any tooltips in here? There's our toggling of our submit button. We don't see any tooltips here. Oh yes, we do. You enable tooltips. So we have a utility that allows us to enable tooltips on a phone. So let's go take a look at that code. Or excuse me, on the phone field. So let's take a look at that. Well, we know where that's coming from. That's coming from our utilities class. All right. So let's look at that tooltip function. There it is. Enable tooltips. It takes an ID of an element. All right. So here it retrieves the element. Now, this code right here, this is Java, allowing us to reference the element. I think I talked about this earlier. Kind of looks like jQuery code, but it's just a shortcut syntax for allowing us to, instead of typing out document.getElementID, we've defined that here, so we don't have to type out that whole thing. It's a shortcut for us. All right, so we retrieve the element, and then we add 4 event handlers to it. When the element focus event is fired, then we're going to fire our show tooltip. If the element's mouse over is fired, we're going to show the tooltip. If the blur event is fired, we're going to hide the tooltip. Or if the mouse out event has occurred, we're going to hide the tooltip. All right. So when I hover, right, that's the 2 events that show the tooltip. When I mouse out, that's the event that removes the tooltip. All right. All right, so we see this show tooltip. So this is referencing the current object, this.show tooltip. So we can see that function right here. Well, what does it do? All right, well, it takes an event. All right. If the type of that event is undefined, right? If it's undefined, we're going to set E to the window.event object. Well, why do we do that? Well, some browsers don't actually send the event object, and we have to get it from the window itself. In other browsers, it does send it. So just in case it isn't there, then we will retrieve it and set E to that. All right. So then we want to look at the target of the event, right? So it could either be the target, E.target, or it could be E.source element, right? So that's differs in different browsers, right? So we want to check for both. It's either going to be target or it's going to be source element, all right? We're going to make that our target. All right, so all we want to do is set the style, the visibility, to visible. All right, so we're going to set it visible, and to remove it we set it hidden. All right, so let's go over to our register form. All right, so we look at our phone. All right, we create a span, and it has the class tooltip that contains the tooltip. So basically all we're doing is hiding and displaying this class, this element, any element that has this class, right? We're hiding it or showing it based on some event. All right, based on some event, we either hide or show that class. All right. So that's how we could use JS to do tooltips. Hide and show them. All right, so let's talk about, we already know how to retrieve values. That's nothing new. We retrieve values using the dot value. We get a reference to the element, and then we use dot value. All right. So here we're retrieving the form. We're using the utilities class. So remember, this is the equivalent of document.getElementById, but we're just using the utilities class. But of course, the actual value, this just returns a reference to the HTML object. If you want the value that is in the form field, you have to access it with the dot value attribute of the object. All right. We can also assign new values to it. So I could just as easily say first name dot value equals Adrian. And that would actually change the value that is displayed in the form field on the page. All right. Select menus. All right, select menus. Let's look at our state. Let's go to the HTML. All right, and we see our state field here. So that is a select field, all right, or select element. Its name is state and its ID is state. All right, so that's our drop-down box for our state. So we see our different options that are available in that select, right? So there's the code in its entirety there. So often if it's a drop box, we need to retrieve the value or the option that was selected. All right, so the key thing here is to remember that you always have to set the value corresponding to what you see on the screen. All right, so then in our code, when we want to retrieve the state, all right, of course we're just going to retrieve the element first of all. Right, so we retrieve the state element, so that gives us a reference to that object. But let's go look at how we use its value. All right, so here we have to check the selected index. All right, so the first is like an array. The first element is going to be 0 and further on. Right, so here we're seeing that we're checking the selected index, the item or the index of the item they selected. If it's not equal to 0, then they've selected a state. Right, so the 0th index means that they left it as select a state. Select a state was our first option. Let's go back to that. Select a state was our first option in that list, so that's the 0th element. So if they didn't select anything, then that index is going to be 0 still. All right. Let's see, was there anything else there I wanted to talk about? That's our selected index. If you want the actual value that they entered, right? You want the actual value, you still should be able to use the dot value for that. Yeah, dot value should still give you the value. I have to check on that. I haven't done that actually in a while. All right, so I'll check on that and let you know. Of course, we can interact with checkboxes as well. All right, we can interact with checkboxes. And yes, we can use the dot value property of that to get the actual value. All right, so we can work with checkboxes too. So checkboxes are those things on the page that can be checked or unchecked, right? So for instance, let's look at this one. This piece. All right, so here we have checkboxes, right? Where we can check something, and then in our code we have to retrieve all the options that were checked, right? So let's take a look at the code that works with checkboxes. All right, so that's pizza. All right, so we can either toggle, well, not toggle. When a person clicks the checkbox, then that's considered toggling. So they check it or they uncheck it. Well, in this case, let's look at that again. When they toggle it, we want something to happen. So for instance, if they say all toppings, notice we select all of them. If they uncheck this, we deselect all of them. So we want to check all the other checkboxes when one is checked in this case. All right, so we know we need events for that. When this event occurs, do all of these. All right. So the question is, what event is that? Well, let's take a look. Right here in our window about unload, we see we get a reference to the checkbox, the toggle one. The event that gets executed is on change. All right, so we're going to set a handler for that, which is toggle checkboxes. So when the on change event of the toggle checkbox occurs, then we call toggle checkboxes. All right, so what does that function do? All right, well, it gets the value field on the checkbox is different. It's going to be .checked, and that's going to be true if it's checked or false if it's not checked. All right. So here we see document.getElement by ID. So we get the toggle, and then we get the checked value, which is going to be true or false, and we store that in status. All right. We also get all the other checkboxes. So look at the what we're using here. Now we're using this query selector. All right. So this means let's query the DOM. And I want you to give me all of the elements that match this pattern. So any element that's an input whose type is equal to checkbox. Give me that back and store it in boxes. So that is going to return a list of elements that are checkboxes. And because it's an array or a list, we need to iterate over it. All right, so we loop through it. All right, and remember, we stored true or false in this status. So we're going to set that element's check status or checked value to whatever the status is. So if this status is true, then all my other boxes become true. If this status is false, then all my other boxes become false. All right. So in truth, it looks complicated, but it's really not that hard once you get a handle of understanding what events you're looking for on form elements, and how to manipulate the CSS, or how to, what particular value you want to access to do something. All right. So on forms, excuse me, on buttons, we know that we're looking for on click. For the tooltips, we're looking for like mouse outs or blurs or something like that. So lots of cool events that we can respond to. All right, so I think that's all I really want to talk about for form events and what we do with forms. So we're going to end this video, but when we come back, I want to take a look at regular expressions, and then when we look at regular expressions, we'll look at how we combine that with our JS and our page to validate our form elements like we did in that registration form. All right, take care.